Good evening. I'm Rory Fitzgerald. I'm Professor of Practice in Survey Research at City University of London. I'm chairing tonight's seminar, which is co-organised by City University of London, European Social Survey and NatCen Social Research. Recurring theme in our seminar series has been moving surveys from probably face-to-face mode in particular to online mode and setting up new surveys online. This has been a recurring theme in our seminar series. And tonight's speakers have had perhaps one of the more challenging ends of that spectrum, dealing with moving household financial surveys online. So we're going to be hearing some of their initial research findings from the work being done by the UK Office for National Statistics. So to introduce our speakers tonight, we have Matt Corey-Bale, who is a Principal Research Officer at the Office for National Statistics. And Matt's been leading on the transformation of data collection for household finance statistics in the ONS. And this primarily involves moving the data collection for household finances to an admin first approach, but complemented by mixed mode data collection. And he's been at ONS for 12 years, working initially on business and private sector employment statistics before spending the last 7 years in more social research projects. And he's joined by Tom Williams, who's a Senior Research Officer, also at the UK Office for National Statistics. And Tom's been a key member of the team, which was the first to deliver on the PAYE real-time information to ONS. And for our non-UK members, PAYE is essentially the way you get paid if you're paid directly by an employer. And that's received a lot of praise throughout the civil service. And Tom spent the last 2 years also working on labour market statistics, and he moved to the household financial team more recently. So I'll hand over to Tom and Matt, and please at the end or towards the end of the seminar series, please put your questions into the Q&A. So I'll hand over to Tom and Matthew.
Okay, thanks very much, Rory. Can you just confirm when you can, Rory, can you just say when you can confirm you can see the slide pack come up on the screen for me? That'd be great.
We can see the slides, thank you.
Excellent, thanks very much. So yeah, thanks everyone for taking the time out of your days to attend this webinar. I really appreciate it. So as Rory said, I'm Matt Corey-Bale, Principal Researcher at ONS, been there for 12 years with about 7 years in social surveys. Done quite a lot of work in social surveys on the News and Lifestyle Survey, which some of you may have heard of, and also some work on the Wealth and Asset Survey before a short stint working on the Family Resources Survey, and then moved into a principal researcher role on household financial statistics transformation in October 2018. I'll just pass you over to Tom quickly, just so Tom can say a few quick words about himself.
Hello, so like Matt said, I'm Tom Williams, been with ONS for around about 3 years. Worked on the PAYE project, which was previously mentioned. That was an incredibly interesting project. It's sort of in tandem with HMRC using payroll data to try and estimate wages and employment and things like that. And then, like previously said, I've stepped across to the sort of household side, which brings a lot of new challenges. And yeah, that's not got too much more to add on that.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, so going to be presenting today on some findings from some initial research we've done into moving household financial statistics or surveys online. Just a caveat before I get started. So this was all pre-COVID. So the research itself took place in June 2019. Another quick heads up, I've got some children running around my house somewhere. If they do burst in here, I've told them not to, but I will have to diplomatically shush them away. So please bear with me if that does happen. Okay, so I'll quickly take you through sort of the aims of what I wanted to cover today for this session. I'm going to give you a bit of a background to household financial statistics transformation, just to put this research into a bit of context. Give an understanding of why ONS needed to conduct this what we call this online uptake test. I'll also clarify what the aims of this research were when we set out to sort of design it, and provide some further information on how the research was conducted. And finally, I'll be passing you over to Tom, who will present some of the key research findings. Okay, so a bit of background then to ONS transformation of household finance surveys. Okay, so ONS is currently running the Census and Data Collection Transformation Program. So that's the wider program of work within ONS that the household financial statistics transformation is wrapped up in. So that includes things, as it says there, census, labour market statistics, transformation, and as I said, household financial statistics transformation, among many other things. I'm not going to go into too much detail on that at the moment, but if you are interested in it, I've included a link on the slide pack, which I think Rory or Stefan will send out after this if you want to go and have a look at that information. Now, within that census and data collection transformation program, there's two really key aspects in the context of social surveys. The first one of those is utilising non-survey data sources, which I think a lot of people refer to as admin data. But I think the more important thing in the context of this bit of research is the digital by default aspirations. And that's not just an ONS aspiration, that's a wider aspiration of the UK government to have all services that interact with the public online and digital by default. Okay, so I'll just give a bit of background as to where we started then with regards to household financial surveys. So historically, there've always been 3 ONS surveys of household finances. Okay, and those are the Living Costs and Food Survey, which is approximately 5,000 households per year. It's a computer-assisted personal interview with a paper diary element as well. And the primary purpose of that is to collect data on expenditure, weights and measures and things like that. As well as collecting data on household incomes. We've also got the Survey of Living Conditions, otherwise known as the SLC, approximately 12,000 households a year. And again, computer-assisted personal interviewing. And we've all then got the Wealth and Assets Survey, okay, otherwise known as WAS, which is approximately 10,000 households per year. And again, has always historically been done by computer-assisted personal interviewing. And that's more looking at collecting data, again, on household incomes, and then also information on basically what things people own and trying to put a monetary value on those. Okay, and I think from this diagram, I've put 3 separate blocks of those surveys because historically they've kind of been treated as silos. So although there's quite a lot of there's a huge amount of overlap between those surveys, particularly when it comes to demographic information for respondents and information on household incomes. Although there's that crossover, they've all been treated slightly differently over time. And as a result of that, they collect the data on some of those concepts, or they did collect data on some of those concepts in slightly different ways because they were treated as separate, distinct surveys. Now, that causes some problems for users, those being that ONS produces 3 separate outputs, or has done historically, which all have slightly different estimates of household income, and the fact that we sort of treat those data differently once they get into or treated those data differently once they got into the office also means that as a result we've got 3 separate outputs with household financial statistics in which all have slightly different figures in them, which for users must be an absolute nightmare. I mean, you want to come to ONS and you want to get one source of household income statistics. You don't want to have to pick and choose depending on what your needs are. So that's the sort of the issue with the historic approach. Okay, so why do we need to transform these surveys? First of all, I mentioned the admin data side earlier. Okay, the availability of non-survey sources is becoming easier to get hold of. As Rory mentioned earlier, and Tom mentioned, we've got things like HMRC's pay-as-you-earn data that are gradually becoming available to us, benefits data from DWP, for example, council tax data. There's all these new sources that we didn't have available to us before that we could potentially use. We want to improve the accuracy of the data that we're collecting. So some of the concepts that we collect on some of these financial surveys can be complex for some of the respondents to answer. Things such as the pay that you receive and some of the breakdowns of that are quite difficult for some respondents to get their heads around. And if we can get that information from elsewhere, admin data, pay-as-you-earn data, and get accurate numbers of that, that would be really useful for us from that data collection perspective. We also want to improve coherence. So as I said earlier, ONS historically produced 3 separate, slightly different estimates of household income. So we want to wrap that up and improve the coherence of what ONS produces and have one source of information for that sort of thing. Reducing respondent burden is a really big thing for us, and that's something that ONS I think is legislated to attempt to do wherever it can. If we can use non-survey data sources, that means that we potentially don't have to ask those questions on our surveys, and that reduces the sort of ask that we have on respondents, which for some of these surveys is quite big already. I think wealth and assets is an example. I think the average interview length when it was face to face is about 110 minutes, which you can imagine is a really big burden for some of these respondents to have to go through. We want to make better use of some of the technologies that are available to us. So anyone who's familiar with ONS may have heard of what we call in our data access platform, which is a new platform for us to store, clean, process and analyze all of the data sources that are being brought into the office. And we want to exploit the opportunities that brings to us. We also want to reduce costs if we can. Again, if we can utilize some of these non-survey data sources, does that mean that we can shorten our questionnaires and save costs there? But also getting things online, for example, face-to-face field work. Anyone who's worked on that knows that is a pretty costly exercise, and if we can collect that data via another cheaper method while still maintaining the quality of that data, that can only be a good thing. Lastly, to improve precision or the granularity. So with those 3 separate surveys, we could never analyze those as one whole piece. What we'd like to get to is somewhere where we can still collect that information on expenditure, on wealth, and on living conditions, but where there's overlap on those surveys, treat that as a single data set, which will enable sort of lower levels of geographies to be analysed, is something that policymakers are crying out for, essentially. Okay, so say a little bit about how ONS is going to meet those needs in a transformed world. Okay, so we're looking to develop what we're calling the Household Finance Survey, or for short, it's the HFS. And that will take an admin data first approach. So where we can use admin data to collect some of those concepts that we're looking at, we're going to take that as a first port of call. Anything that can't be supplied via admin data would be, so we collect that via an online first mixed mode survey. Okay, and that survey would be modularized with a mix of what we call core content. So that's the content that encompasses all 3 of those surveys that I talked about earlier, and an element of topic specific content. So people will get routed off into either expenditure, wealth, or living conditions. And on the next slide, I've just put something in so that you can see that, try and get that across visually. So you can see that admin data first approach at the top. And then with regards to the survey itself, which is those green boxes, we've got the core content, which is just things like your demographics, and then things like your work and employment, income, housing and tenure, savings, things like that. And then, as I said, the respondents would get routed off to one of those sort of 3 modules, and those are the expenditure module, which meets the existing needs of the living costs and food survey, and that's all your expenditure, weights and measures for your food and drink. The wealth module to meet the needs of wealth and assets, and that's things like property, vehicles, valuables, savings, investments and pension pots, but also covers things like debt as well. So we're talking loans, credit cards, mortgages, arrears, things like that. And there's also some questions on there around financial planning and attitudes to that as well. And we've also then the other module there is the living conditions and other news and needs module, which is there to meet the existing needs of the survey on living conditions. And the data for the wealth and living conditions we want to be available longitudinally in the same way that they are now. And that survey would, as I said, would be the strategic aim is for that to be a mixed mode survey with an online first approach. Okay, so why did we need to do an online test? Well, we've already got some previous research from the labour market survey development, which suggested that at the time that we did this test, that a 28 to 30% online response rate was achievable. And I think now those response rates are actually even higher on the labour market survey. So I think we're getting 41% sort of people log in with a 36% completion rate. So that's even higher than the figures that we've got there. So if we know that information, why do we need to do it? Why do we need to know it for the HFS? we just had no internal evidence within ONS to confirm whether we could replicate that on a financial survey. There'd been some debate within ONS as to whether financial data was suitable for collection online. And whilst we're having some quite good conversations, there was just no hard evidence on which to base some of the decisions that we needed to make in terms of the development of the HFS. We know that some of the reasons behind that is transformation of some of the content to enable to be suitable for online data collection. It requires a significant time and resource investment in that. So we've got a research and development team within Social Surveys Transformation, headed up by Laura Wilson, who some of you may have attended some of the talks that she's done before. If you haven't, go and have a look at the work she's done. It's absolutely brilliant. But that does take quite a lot of time and quite a lot of resource to get it just right. The HFS content, financial content by its own nature, is very complicated. There are some terms that not a lot of people understand. It's one of the more difficult things to collect online, where you don't have an interviewer present to support the respondent with some of that and give guidance and advice as to how they should be completing those returns. And the HFS content, as I said earlier, with wealth and assets, sort of an average of 110 minutes, it's really extensive. Before we go and start a program of work looking at redesigning all of that content that we've got there, we want to make sure that if we ask people to participate in a financial survey, that they will engage with us and won't just throw the materials away or in the bin or anything like that. So if engagement with sort of a basic survey a basic financial survey is really low, that just calls into question the whole viability of developing a Wave 1 online HFS. And essentially, if the results from this research were too poor, then it means that we would probably not make that big investment that we would need to make to get something like this online. Okay, I'll cover the research questions in the next section of this then, and what it was exactly that we wanted to find out. So the big question was, will households engage if they are asked to participate in an online survey of household finances by ONS? Okay, and we developed that question into two primary research questions. The first of those is overall engagement and completion level. So by engagement, I mean, will people or will households log in if they're asked to complete a survey? And by completion, I mean they get to the end of it and complete that survey. So ultimately, what proportion of the households are going to participate if we ask them to take part in an online survey of household finances? The other primary research question is, are households more or less likely to respond if they're told what reference documentation they need beforehand? The thinking behind that is that if we specify to people that we're going to ask you questions on sensitive topics such as your income, benefits and benefit amounts, savings, things like that, and we tell people beforehand that we're going to ask them about that, is that going to put them off responding, or is that going to put them off taking part? So that was another thing that we took the opportunity to look at. Those were our two primary research questions. We also came up with some secondary research questions that weren't sort of directly related to that, but we thought would be useful to look at. Now, the way that we've designed this, we can't directly measure data quality from what we're getting back from this, but there are a few things that we know are associated with good levels of data quality that we thought we could look at. So although not direct indicators, they can give us an indication of data quality. One is questionnaire break-off. So if people break off early in the questionnaires and you've got half of the questionnaire incompleted, that leads to poorer data quality, because you have to then take steps to account for that in your analyses. Item non-response. So what I mean by that is if a particular question hasn't been answered by an individual who's responded, that would be an item non-response. And high levels of item non-response, again, associated with poorer levels of data quality, because you have to take steps to address that in analysis, such as imputation or estimating what those values are. We've also got unit non-response. By that, I mean, if we have a responding household and one of the people within that household doesn't take part at all, then that's what we class as unit non-response. And again, similar to item non-response, higher levels of unit non-response are associated with poorer levels of data quality. Proxy rates is also something that we were able to look at as part of this. Again, for those who aren't familiar with proxy rate, that is where someone else from the household provides the answers on behalf of one of their fellow household members. An example of poor data quality there is I might give answers for my wife with regards to her income, but does she tell me all of the income that she has? Maybe not. Maybe she does. Maybe she doesn't. But high proxy rates generally associated with sort of poorer data quality. And the last one that we thought we could look at is the recontact permission rate. So as I said earlier, the Wealth and Assets Survey and the Survey on Living Conditions, they're longitudinal. They go back to respondents, again and again. If people take part in something and then don't provide permission to recontact over numerous waves, that can cause issues with if you have high levels of attrition, and that leads to sort of poor data quality for your longitudinal analyses. So those are some of the extra things that we thought that, again, weren't the primary aims of the research, but could give us some really useful information on which to base some of the future activity that we're planning. Okay, thinking about the delivery of this research then, and some of the high level specifications for it. So in terms of the delivery, we contracted out the programming and hosting of the online content to Ipsos Mori. At the time that we did this research, there were a few other pieces of online research we had to do within ONS, and so we contracted out that part to Ipsos Mori. All other aspects ONS was responsible for this. So that includes things like selecting the sample. So we'd select the sample of households and addresses and send that to Ipsos, send that to Ipsos Mori and send out the sort of the materials and things like that. We designed all of the contents. That was designed again by the research and design team that I mentioned earlier. We were also responsible for designing the materials. So that's the sort of the invitation letters and things like that. ONS also responsible for providing support to respondents if needed via our survey inquiry line, and that's something we already have set up for the existing data collections that we do. But we had to, there was quite a bit of work put into it to ensure that they were fully prepared for receiving queries from some of the respondents that we'd sampled. ONS also responsible for for analysing the data and publishing any findings from it. Okay, so the high level specifications for the test then. So we took a systematic random sample of approximately 16,500 households, and they were wave one households. So essentially, it was a completely fresh sample. We hadn't been out to any of these households before. We did not subsample from any of the existing surveys. This was a fresh systematic random sample of 16,500 households, and we needed that number to sort of get the power of the test that we needed to do to assess whether the differences were detectable. Just to note, that sample was from England and Scotland only. So any of my Welsh colleagues that are here who are feeling left out, I feel your pain. I'm Welsh as well. But we had a fairly limited budget for this test, and there was a really, really quick turnaround for it as well. Doing the Welsh translations and things like that would have put this project outside the timelines that we had to work with. Hence why we looked at just England and Scotland, because we were trying to get a sort of general picture of engagement with this survey. We felt that was adequate for this. Okay, we had two test groups within this. So that 16,500 sample was split into two test groups, and they were called the generic and tailored advanced materials groups. So the generic group received some, the materials that they received beforehand were a little bit more general. The tailored group they received materials that were a lot more specific in terms of telling respondents what they were going to get asked about. And there's something about that on the next slide that I'll go through. We used Dimensions software for the test, so that's Ipsos Mori's online software that they use to collect data online. And the data were collected over a 4-week period in June 2019. So we told the respondents and all the materials that the survey was going to be live for 3 weeks, but actually we kept that survey open for a further week to see whether people would still send stuff in after that time. Okay, so looking at some of the materials then, or the difference in the materials that these two groups received. So on the left-hand side there, you'll see what we call our generic materials. And you can see, looking through there, it's a letter, ONS branded letter, signed off by one of our DGs, Ian Bell, just giving a bit of background to what we're asking respondents to do. we wanted to make this look as real life as possible. So as far as respondents were concerned, this was a real life data collection. We didn't tell them that they were part of a test. Just some general information about ONS and sort of explaining what was coming up. So that was our pre-invitation letter. On the right hand side is the tailored material, so the equivalent letter for the tailored group. And as you can see, I've circled in red there. It's pretty much the same, except there's an extra section in here. Look, just explaining some of the things that we're going to ask about. So it says here online banking, pay slips, statements. And within that letter as well, there was also a checklist of some of the things that the respondents might need to call upon whilst completing the survey. So, for example, things to do with their income, pay slips, pension and benefit statements, details of rent and mortgage payments, council tax bills, any details of housing benefit, and also some utility bills. So that was what the tailored group received. So in terms of the materials and the distribution of these then, so the pre-notification letters that I showed you there were sent 9 days before the survey go live date. And as I said, it introduced ONS, gave a bit of a background to what we're doing. And there were some contact details on there along with a reference number so that anyone who had any queries could get in touch with ONS and find out more about it, check that it's a genuine data collection, for example, and we're not scammers, essentially. 2 days before the survey went live, so that's a week after the pre-note letter, the sort of the formal invitation letter was sent out, and that contained the login details that the households would need to get into the online survey, with a unique access code associated with that. Gave a little bit of detail about some broad information about the interview length. So we anticipated that it would be 20 to 30 minutes in length. I suppose interview is not the right word, is it? The survey length was anticipated to be 20 to 30 minutes. It let them know when the survey was open, so the completion dates, and it also had as an incentive what we call a tote bag. So for those who don't know what that tote bag is or have never heard it before, that's basically it's a bag made out of material. It's got an ONS logo on it, and some of the previous research that our R&D team have done has indicated that that's a cost-effective unconditional incentive to encourage people to take part. Finally, then, we were due to send out a reminder 7 days after the go live date. In reality, I think we pushed that back a week as there were some issues with printing capacity, which may have had an impact on some of the final response that we saw, but that was unavoidable. That reminder was pretty, it had all the same details in that the invitation letter had, but unfortunately, nobody was lucky enough to get a second tote bag with that. So I just really want to clarify here what this test does tell us or is able to tell us. So firstly, it delivers evidence of the feasibility of undertaking further research into a Wave 1 online HFS transformational model. Okay, it will be able to indicate some of the behaviours of respondents when self-completing an online survey with an online financial survey. So we received quite a bit of paradata from Ipsos Mori. So that's things like whether people change their responses after filling it in, things like that. Timings for questions and sections and for different individuals within the household, and also things like proxy rates and things like that. So that's some of the behaviours that we were able to sort of look at. The test also would give us a better understanding, a better understanding as we didn't have any understanding of the similarities and differences between collecting labour market and household financial data online, which was something that we were really keen to look at. And ultimately, what this test was designed to inform the approach to the transformation of the household financial survey and the redesign of the questions and what direction we wanted to go in with some of the future research that we want to do. A few things that I want to make clear that the test does not do. Okay, so this certainly does not demonstrate the ultimate viability of a Wave 1 online HFS. The purpose of this test is purely to determine whether it is worth pursuing further research into that approach. Okay, it also will not provide accurate online response rates for a future HFS. So although we can get an idea of whether people will engage with this survey, it's not going to give us sort of a long-term online response rate that we could expect to get for a fully developed household financial online survey. It's also not designed to give comparable statistical estimates against any of those existing financial surveys. I'll go into a bit more detail in some of the slides coming up, but some of the financial content, it wasn't optimized for online collection. As I said, the primary purpose of this was to see whether people would engage if we asked them to. Okay, so I'm going to cover some of the content for the survey next. Okay, so I've put on this slide some of the topics for the test. We've got household composition, accommodation, mortgage and rent payments, council tax, utilities, socio-demographics and well-being, employment and economic status, income from both employment and from self-employment, health, income from private and personal pensions, savings in investments, and income from benefits. So they were the topics that we decided to include for this test. Okay, so this slide, I'm just going to quickly split this down. The red section there is what we call the household section. So those were questions that were answered by one household member but applied to the entire household. And that was we anticipated it to be approximately 18 minutes of content. Okay, the person level topics there are the remaining ones that I've highlighted in yellow. And we anticipated that would be approximately 7 minutes worth of content for that. And in terms of how those were designed, so 3 of those topics were optimized for online collection. So we'd already done or the R&D team had already done loads of work on that when they were developing the labour market survey content. There's been quite a long and thorough program of work done on that, and because we know that those sort of blocks are already suitable for collection online, we basically reuse the LMS content for those blocks. So they were optimized for online collection. Okay, sorry, the remaining blocks there. So as I said, there's been quite a lot of work done within the R&D team redesigning that LMS content, and that team has been able to sort of develop some underlying principles for some of the things that are good practice when collecting things online. So those remaining blocks that I've highlighted in white there, although they didn't go through a full redesign, the R&D team applied some of those principles to the questions in those blocks, so that it wasn't just a straight lift and shift from some of the existing content that we've got. Things like making sure that it's displayed on the screen properly, and sort of minimizing some of the instructions that we give to respondents so as not to confuse them too much. Okay, the main income topics that we cover then, so as I said earlier, we've got income from employment, income from self-employment, income from benefits, including your state retirement pension, and income from private and personal pensions. We wanted to include those because we know that that people can be quite sensitive about some of those topics, and people might not know those things off the top of their heads, and it may require some consultation of paperwork for some people. Those topics also cover the economic status for a wide part of the population, and it captures the largest proportion of household income generally, employee income, self-employed income, benefits and pensions. That they're the main types of income that people within a household can receive. We were also able to route through to those sections quite easily, but using the redesigned LMS questions that I talked about earlier, and that content also, we wanted the content of the survey to match what we told respondents that they could expect to receive in those advanced materials. So hence why we chose those topics. Briefly, quickly, going to go through what was involved in those topics then. So the socio-demographics is things like whether people have responded by proxy, their age, marital status, things like that. We had self-reported general health, and the employment section looked at whether people were employed, things like that, if they had a second job, the industry and occupation that they work in. The pay from employment. Now, we didn't go into huge amounts of detail with this. So I know on the existing surveys, we collect a lot of information about various breakdowns of pay. We just wanted to collect net and gross pay here, just to reflect what was in that advanced material. And the same for the self-employment. We've got state pension in there, so whether people get state retirement pension and the amount, and again, the same with pension credit. For private and personal pensions, again, it was whether people are receiving them, and if so, whether how much they get paid of those and what sort of sums are they. We covered a few different types of benefits, but by no means tried to collect information on every benefit a person could possibly get, along with the amounts received. And then looked at whether people had any personal savings or any investments, and asked them to provide responses on that. Okay, the questionnaire itself then, in terms of how people went through that. So initially, the first thing that was answered was the household section. As I said earlier, completed by one person on behalf of the rest of the household, and that covered the household composition, the relationships of the householders to each other, housing tenure, details of mortgage and rent payments and amounts, council tax payments, and then some further information on some of the utilities bills that people will receive. Now, once that household section was completed, then you had the option, or the respondents had the options, to go through to the individual interviews, and they didn't have to, they didn't have to complete that in any particular order. So the first person entered in the household sort of section, or the household, what we always call the household grid, wasn't necessarily the person who had to complete that survey first, and it could be completed by the person themselves or by proxy. The key thing here, I suppose, is that we had to be really mindful of data security with some of this. So as some of the topics that I talked about earlier, they're quite sensitive. If somebody completes their individual interview, would they want another household member being able to go through that and look at the responses that they've given? Certainly not. So we had to make sure that we'd lock that survey down if people had finished their individual interview, but also if an individual got like halfway through their interview, decided they wanted to take a break and logged out, if they logged back in, they were not able then to go and look at their previous responses. They were only able to then carry on from where they had left off. Again, this was a test, but still really, really important to us to make sure that data security was at the forefront of what we were doing. Once those individual sections were completed, we collected a little bit of sort of post-survey information, things like recontact information, and that covered, whether people had consulted documents when completing the survey. We collected some phone numbers and emails if people were willing to take part in future research, and there was a brief question asking for people's, experiences of the survey, just so that could inform any of the future work we did. Okay, so that's the sort of background to things. I'm going to pass you over to Tom now to talk through some of the outcomes and some of the findings from the research.
Thank you very much, Matt. Am I on camera now? Can anyone tell me, should I start?
Yeah, we can see you.
Beautiful. Okay, so like Matt previously mentioned, the primary purpose of this test was to establish whether households would participate in an online survey of household finances. So in order to answer this question, there were two main metrics that we looked at. So the engagement rate, so whether the household engaged with the online survey by logging into it, and the survey completion rate, so whether the household completed the survey in its entirety. So the test also aimed to establish whether households would be more or less likely to engage and complete the survey if they were told in advance the financial topics that the survey would cover. So as you can see from figure 1, the overall online test achieved a 20.7% engagement rate and a 16.5% completion rate. Households in the generic test group were more likely to both engage with and complete the survey. At 24.5%, the engagement rate for the generic group was 7.6 percentage points higher than the 16.9% one seen in the Taylor group. Likewise, the 19% completion rate in the generic group was 5 percentage points higher than the 14% seen in the Taylor group. So it appears from these results that including details of the financial nature of the survey did discourage some people from participating. Just to give these figures some context, the LMS, I think Matt mentioned previously, the LMS achieved around about 28%, and I think it is a lot higher now. It's worth noting that has gone through an extensive R&D process, about 3.5 years of research. The HFS online test had no such budget or time to go through such an extensive program R&D. So that may go some way to explaining why the engagement rates and completion rates were slightly lower than you see in that survey. Next slide, please. Okay, so like Matt mentioned, there's not a direct way to assess data quality, but we did want to try and sort of be able to quantify a little bit with some of the way that the questions were answered. However, we were able to look at some of the measures that we know are associated with data quality, and these were document consultation rates, level of rounding for financial variables, proxy rates, item non-response, unit non-response. So over the next few slides, I'm going to run through some of these metrics and hopefully we can draw some conclusions from them. Next slide, thank you. So collection of financial data in a household setting is notoriously difficult to collect accurately. These difficulties include recall issues, so where respondent has difficulty remembering the exact amounts for the values being requested, or definition differences, where respondents do not understand what it is they're being asked to provide. And obviously, these are problems with face-to-face interviews. Obviously, doing this online increases these difficulties. So the use of reference documentation can help address these difficulties. For example, a respondent can use a pay slip to provide more accurate amounts of gross and net pay for a given time period. So higher level of document consultations can be an indicator of high level of data quality. So figure 2 shows that 57.3% of the tailored test group were more likely to refer to documentation during the questionnaire, compared with 35.7% of those in the generic group, a difference of 21.6 percentage points. It's worth noting that obviously this is, as you would expect, considering that the tailored group were given prior warning of the sort of financial nature of the survey. Next slide, please. I'll just briefly touch upon the sort of types of documentation that was consulted. So those in the tailored group were more likely to refer to both paper and electronic documentation during the survey. So this large difference may indicate for this measure of data quality that households in the tailored test group could have provided better quality data than those in the generic group. Next slide, please. So the next 3 charts I'm going to show you provide the cumulative percentage of respondents who rounded their answers. So when asked to provide a value for the financial variables, respondents could enter an exact amount to the nearest penny or could round to whatever level they deemed appropriate. So again, lower levels of rounding can provide more precise values and thus could be an indicator of higher levels of data quality. So figure 4 shows us that 10.5% of households in the Taylor group provided more exact answers or answers to the nearest penny, compared with 6% of those in the generic group. And for the Taylor group, 67% provided answers to the nearest pound or better, compared with 58.2% in the generic group. Next slide, please. So figure 5 shows us that 12.7% of those in the Taylor group provided responses to the nearest penny for employee pay, with 33.1% rounding to the nearest pound or better. This compares to about 8% and 28% of the generic group, respectively. So this pattern is representative of the pattern observed for other household financial variables, such as council tax, mortgage payments. The Taylor group performed consistently better and provided higher levels of rounding than those in the generic group. Next slide, please. So figure 6 shows that fewer than 1 in 10 provided values for the self-employed pay to the nearest £10, and more of those in the Taylor group provided these answers to the nearest £100 or better. It is worth noting that obviously this chart is slightly different to the other chart, because obviously self-employed income is a lot more difficult to accurately know yourself. So it's not surprising that the level of rounding was obviously a lot higher. Similar patterns were generally seen across the benefits and pension variables. So these results can indicate that those in the Taylor group were more likely to provide financial values to better levels of precision than those in the generic group. Again, this can be a possible indicator of higher data quality. So next slide, please. So the story with rounding is that finer precision, as I mentioned, is generally associated with better data quality. We know that this is not always the case, but it can be an indicator. If you know your income to the nearest penny, then you generally would expect this to be more accurate figure than someone who rounds to the nearest £100. So previous slides have shown that various variables where the Taylor group provided values that appear to be more precise and thus could indicate higher levels of data quality. It is worth mentioning, though, that because of the sample sizes, it's not always possible to draw robust conclusions from this metric of data quality. Next slide, please. So I think, as Matt previously mentioned, a survey is completed by proxy when an individual questionnaire has been completed, but the responses for that section have been supplied by another member of the household. Studies have shown that proxy responses can be less accurate than personal responses. This issue can become more prevalent for financial data, where individuals within a household may not have a full picture of finances, the fellow household members said. Like Matt previously said, he'd like to think that he knows all of his wife's finances. I'd be interested to see if that was the case. But anyway, figure 7 shows that just under 1 in 5 of those who answered the individual section had their answers provided by proxy. And this is broadly consistent across both test groups, indicating that having prior knowledge of the financial data of the survey in this metric did not really impact its propensity for proxy answers. And just to give this figure a little bit of context, figure 8 shows the level of proxy responses on surveys that are similar to this, with the LMS and the LCF being there. And you can see it's around about the same. Next slide, please. So item non-response is where a respondent does not enter a value for a specific survey question. Higher levels of item non-response are associated with, well, can be associated with poorer data quality, as these missing values will need to be estimated using statistical techniques. Figure 9 shows the proportion of records which have some missing values for a survey section. So respondents in the generic group were more likely than those in the tailored group to provide incomplete information across each of the financial sections of the questionnaire: household bills, employee pay, self-employed pay, pension income, and benefit income. Obviously the standout in this graph is the employee pay, and the higher missing rate in employee pay could be because of the respondents being asked before and after tax. So, but levels of completion were broadly the same for the non-financial variables, such as the demographics and unemployment. So these findings suggest that receiving the tailored set of advanced survey materials led to better rates of item completion across the financial sections of the survey. Next slide, please. So unit non-response occurs when an individual within a household refuses or fails to complete any part of their individual survey. So high unit non-response is associated with poorer data quality, as the values for these individuals need to be estimated using statistical techniques. So figure 10 shows us that the rate of unit non-response was lower for individuals in the tailored test group, around about 7.2%, than for individuals in the generic test group, so around about 10.7%. So you can see a similar story with unit non-response that we had in item non-response. Next slide, please. So the summary of data quality. So most data quality measures indicated that the test group provided better quality data than those in the generic group. This was the case for reference to financial documentation when completing the survey, provision of financial values to a better level of provision, like levels of item non-response for financial variables, and level of unit non-response. And I will just again emphasize that this isn't a direct measure of data quality, but obviously with doing this test we wanted to try and get some measures of data quality from the data. Next slide, please. I think Matt mentioned that WAS is, I think, 110 minutes, which is a long survey, and we know that longer surveys impose a larger burden on survey respondents. This in turn can lead to lower response rates. So in order for us to have more confidence in our completion and engagement rate, we wanted to make sure that our survey was not too long. It is also important in the interest of openness and transparency that the respondents are adequately informed of the likely time burden. So there's two main questions to answer here. Were the observed lengths of time taken to complete the questionnaire in line with the researchers' expectations? And did the completion time differ between tailored and generic group? So our researchers estimated that the survey would take approximately 20 to 30 minutes for the whole household to complete. And as you can see here, the survey was pretty much bang on in the middle of that. And there wasn't a lot of difference between the generic and tailored, with the tailored taking slightly the medium tailored time being slightly lower than the generic one. Next slide, please. So we also wanted to look at whether those in the tailored test group were more likely to drop out the survey than those in the generic group. In particular, whether being pre-warned of the financial topics covered in the survey affected the likelihood that someone would drop out the survey. So higher dropout rates, again, associated with poor data quality. So the tailored group was less likely to drop out the questionnaire after starting it, with 17.4% dropout rate compared to a 22.5% in the generic group. However, it is worth mentioning again that the generic group did have a higher completion rate than the tailored group. Next slide, please. So some elements of a fully redesigned survey of household finance would need to be collected repeatedly over a set time period. So in order to achieve this, it's essential that responding households provide permission to recontact and provide contact details. So it is of interest to see whether the advanced survey materials had an impact on permission to recontact. So 3 out of 4 responding households provided permission to recontact, with those in the tailored group more likely to provide permission than those in the generic group. So it's a 77.7% and 72.9% respectively. So although the generic group achieved higher engagement and response rates, in the long term, the increased permission to recontact may provide better longitudinal data. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, households will engage when asked to complete an online survey. We were fairly pleased with the results. Like I said, it wasn't as high as the LMS, but considering the sort of speed at which this was created and the R&D process we went through, we were feeling pretty positive about the results. Households will be more likely to engage and to respond if they're not told about topics that would be covered on the survey and the documentation needed. Again, this is as to be expected. If I didn't know who ONS was and I got asked to submit financial information online, I would probably be quite skeptical, even if I did get a fantastic tote bag from ONS. There's a little plug there in there. So the quality metrics were better for households who were told what would be covered on the survey. So further research is needed to look at the feasibility of collecting extensive financial data online. And the really important thing is there does seem to be a trade-off between obtaining high response rates and data quality. So I'll just pass you back to Matt, who will go through the sort of future of the household financial survey.
Yeah, so just going to give you a really brief overview then of what we're looking to in the future with household financial statistics. Now, everyone's going to be familiar with this, I would have thought, but earlier this year, ONS had to do some significant reprioritization of its activity as a result of coronavirus. You know, we had to reprioritize where we were directing our resources to. As a result of that reprioritization, the HFS transformation work has been put on hold from March 2020. So the team that I run, that Tom's a part of as well. So we were involved in some of the stuff around the opinions and lifestyle survey and the COVID, the COVID data that were being collected on that. And we had to direct all of our resources towards that because the government just needed that information. You know that was a really high priority for the government. Now ONS is now looking to sort of reinitiate the HFS project, but there's a few things now. I think the world is very different now to how it was, 6 to 9 months ago. So we need to account for that in the new world that it looks like we're going to be living. So the main things that we're looking to take into account essentially are, we're now looking at a COVID or a post-COVID world. What implications does that have for how we want to manage this project and implement it? And also, I say the UK has departed from the EU, but I suppose the key thing there is, I suppose we're getting, over the next few months, we're going to get far more clarity on what that relationship with the EU is. Now, the survey on living conditions is the survey that ONS runs to meet or always ran to meet the EU statistics on income and living conditions. Our changed relationship with the European Union, does that mean that we we still have to meet all of the things that we were meeting 2 years ago when we were fully integrated into the EU? So those are some of the things that we need to start thinking about, and that may lead to some changes in the way that we deliver that project. So essentially, if you're interested in the HFS and want to know what's going on with it, it's getting looked at now. We're sort of reinitiating it, and yeah, there'll be more coming out from that over the next few months. So that is everything from me. Thanks very much for listening, everybody. Hope we won't too taxing on you. And yeah, I suppose just Rory, is it time for questions if anyone's got any?
Absolutely. Thank you very much to Matt and Tom for a fantastic presentation.